I'm in New York.
Ah,
Michelle Ashford, you're the creator and executive producer of Showtime's Masters of Sex. It tells the story of real life scientists William Masters and Virginia Johnson, who studied human sexuality in the 50s and 60s. What first interested you in their story?
well, I didn't know hardly anything about Masters and Johnson. I mean, I knew that they had existed and I knew they had something to do with sex. And then about 7 years ago, my producing partner found a review on the New York Times of a book, a biography of Masters and Johnson. And she read the review and said, I think we should read this book. It sounds fascinating. And I thought, oh, I don't know. I mean, as a series? And she said, no, I think so. So we read the book, and it was astounding because Tom Mayer, who wrote the book, it's a wonderful book, interviewed Virginia Johnson, and she told him things that she'd never told anybody about their careers, but also about their personal lives, which were very complicated and really interesting. And so I read the book and I thought, oh my God, that is a series. It's so complicated. It goes on and on and on. There's all these different chapters, literally, but also in terms of figuratively, these different periods in their lives. And so I thought this is pretty exciting because it's pretty rare in television that you can see a whole series from beginning to end, before you've even started.
Yeah, the series, deals with these real life characters and their real research. So to what degree, are you guided by the actual history, and to what degree are you exploring your own fictionalized version of it?
Well, it's funny, I felt an obligation to be pretty faithful to the history. I certainly feel an obligation to always be faithful to the work that they were doing. So whatever we're showing in terms of their scientific discoveries and the work and the protocols that they came up with, that is all completely real. But it's funny, after the first year, I looked back and I thought, because someone had asked me this question, how much did you make up? And I thought, God, I don't even remember what's what anymore. And I went back and looked, and we were remarkably faithful. I mean, really, almost down to the last detail in terms of everything that we had portrayed. And so what we do in terms where we do veer slightly off from the real story is when we're talking about the other characters that are around their lives. So we combine characters, and we take maybe just parts of characters and turn them into characters, or we come up with entirely new characters whole cloth. But for the most part, we are really sticking to the story. We're sticking to a lot of the dates and making sure that those are accurate. And no, we really want to tell the real story. And it's fascinating enough. I mean, as they say, truth being stranger than fiction. So.
Yeah, in more ways than just the sex and the research, the show seems particularly interested in the roles and experiences of women during the period, both professionally and personally and socially. Was that always a central part of how you wanted to explore this world in this period?
I feel very lucky because I didn't have to come at this with any kind of an agenda. They Masters and Johnson he was certainly a scientist and a doctor first, and she came on board with the same idea of really dedicating themselves to the work and the data that they would collect. So he spent 12 years, she spent 10, collecting all this data. And what happened, I mean, they would be the last people to call themselves feminists, ever. In fact, she really rejected that term. But what happened is, when they looked at all this data, they realized the story that it told was that women were these sexually robust creatures. I mean, they were sort of more sexually, I don't want to say advanced than men, but that there was this whole life going on with women. And because they were faithful to their work, they published this. And that was pretty radical, because up till then, men were considered sort of dominant in the bedroom, and a woman's needs were considered secondary. And all of a sudden this, and it happened to come out at the same time as the pill, and the 60s were kind of going crazy. And so they became these incredible sort of standard bearers for women, and saying this is how women can reimagine their lives. But it was really because that's where the science led them. They would not have done that otherwise. It wasn't an agenda on their part. So luckily, when I get to tell this story, I just can show what happened. The other thing that's that's remarkable is Virginia Johnson, was a woman really ahead of her time, and it just was who she was naturally. So I don't have to make that up either. So while I'm happy to be championing the causes of women on my own without being prompted, this one was just fell in my lap this way. That's really how their work was, and that's how she was. She was really quite remarkable, despite the fact she would not want to be considered a feminist. I think often women of that generation found that something about that very strident, and she didn't want to get into that. But of course, she was a complete feminist.
Looking back at this period, from our modern perspective, in hindsight, do you think we've come a long way from those, kind of rigid and repressed values, or are we closer to that and still more stuck in that than we, like to think we are?
This is such a complicated question, and I think it's funny. There's so many ways to look at things like this, and how things evolve and history progresses. It's always sort of 2 steps forward and 1 back. And you could say, for example, we have an African American president, and yet we have horrific riots and injustices going on in our cities right now around the subject of race. So, as with women, it's funny, I was just at a thing where our Senator Barbara Boxer was saying, someone said, "Oh, you're not going to run for the Senate. Now we won't have 2 women senators." And she goes, "Oh, the woman thing, it's over. It's done. We've made it." And I thought that was a funny comment, especially for a woman who's worked so hard and has broken so many barriers. I think it's a complicated thing. In terms of women, the advancement of women, obviously women have come an enormous way. Sexually, obviously, they can own their own, but some of this stuff takes a long time to get sorted out, and there's always going to be disparities, like women being the child bearers, and so there's a lot has improved, a lot hasn't. In terms of sexually, Masterson Johnson explained how people's bodies work in a way that people did not understand before. So they did a remarkable service, because people were really confused. Although we even now find sometimes in our writers' rooms, we'll find that people are still a little confused. But in terms of understanding the biology of sex, Masterson Johnson did the world an enormous service, and also just talking about it so frankly was a sort of eye-opening and revolutionary. But the thing about sex is that you very quickly, if you spend any time talking about this subject or experiencing it, you get into emotional areas and the dynamics of power between men and women. And those are things that have not changed very much at all. And sort of the mysteries of intimacy and why you love who you love and what does it mean and how do you attain intimacy, all these things. Those haven't changed at all. So the great news is I would never want to do a period piece, because that had no relationship to what we're living through now. And so what I've found over and over and again with this show is that it's in fact incredibly relevant. That what people are struggling with, they still struggle with today. And so in that sense, hopefully, while it's set in the past, it feels very much like, oh yes, I know that problem, I have it too, or I know, so I think it feels, I hope it feels very contemporary in that way.
There were some big changes during the second season of the show, which aired last summer, including a big 3-year time jump in the timeline of the story. What made you decide to push the story forward in that way?
Well, I had a weird problem, because I don't really know other TV shows have ever kind of run across this. I had a nonfiction story, and when you read Tom's book, it spans their careers and lives together, span about 30 plus years. And some of the really interesting stuff happens toward the end. And I thought, well, when we didn't get canceled, and in cable, it's a funny thing, once you're sort of in, if you're in, you're in. It's not like network television where you can get canceled at the drop of a hat. And so I thought, oh, we may end up telling this whole story. We may actually be in here for the long haul. So then immediately you have to go, well, how would you divide this material up? And if we're going to really tell the whole story, we're not going to go 30 seasons. We're, you know, so you have to start cutting this material up. So the first season, I wanted people to settle in and understand the show and the characters. So just going sort of a straight sort of year or so of a time period seemed right. But then we had the second season. I thought, well, we got to move. And so I thought, well, let's start the second season 3 years later. Let's just pick it up there. And then everyone said, no, everyone's going to feel so cheated. They want to know what happened at the end of the sort of cliffhanger at the end of season one. So then we started season two basically on the heels of that. But I still said, we have to move. And so all of a sudden I just thought, what if we did something really crazy in the middle of the season, did one episode that just rips through time? And so we did it that way. So it was an impossible episode to structure. It was just about killed all of us. And it was hard to direct. And the actors would say, what year am I in? And I mean, it was just kind of a mess. But I think at the end, when it all came together, it was pretty interesting because you just see this weird progression. And what I thought would be fun is like to let time tell part of the story. So time, either people have changed and that tells you something about who they are, or after 3 years, people have not changed. And that also tells you something really interesting. So, you know, we're not going to do that again in this season. Season 3, we are going a straight shot. Again, we're not going to make a big time jump in the middle, but eventually we will do it. We will do another weird time thing again. And actually, as a writer, it's a kind of a fun, although exhausting challenge to figure out how to do that in a way that's really smart and uses time to actually enhance your story.
You know, dealing with so much history, you know, 30 years worth, how do you decide what, you know, to put in, what to leave out? Is there a lot of killing your darlings, you know, involved in the process of writing the show?
A little bit. You do have to make some tough choices. And for example, so we started in 1956 and went into 57 for the first year. Then we went from sort of 57, 58 into January of 61 for our second year. But then I had to look at their careers and say, and their lives and say, what was the next sort of really juicy thing? And the next thing they did that was really changed their lives was publish their book. They had been researching all this time, and in 1966, they actually published their first book called Human Sexual Response. So that changed their lives radically. Up until then, they had basically been working, carrying on this relationship. She dated, he was still married and everything. So it seemed like sort of a quiet period. And I thought, well, if we're going to skip over anything, I guess we skip over that. And let's just jump right to when they published this book, because their lives just did a 180 after that. And so that's the year. So the third season starts at the end of sort of 65 and just goes straight into 66, the release of this book and what happens as a result.
Bill, you know, on the show is often, cold sometimes and hurtful to Virginia and his wife and others around him sometimes. You know, how do you walk that fine line, you know, with this character, you know, being sort of a product of his time, but also maintaining our sympathy and our ability to relate to him?
Well, it's really interesting that has been the subject of many, many discussions. Michael Sheen is a fantastic partner in this, and incredibly smart and intuitive about this character, and in general he is. But so we've talked a lot about it, and he's a very, very brave actor. And so one of the things we kind of hit upon from the beginning was that, you know, and I think for Michael, what made this character really tick and made him understand him was that this William Masters was the victim of terrible abuse when he was growing up, which is all true. And he had a brutal father, and essentially from the age of 14 on was by himself and had to kind of take care of himself. And so this so deeply informed who that man was. And in real life, he was an odd duck and sort of removed. And as he said himself many times, I'm not the one with the people skills. I mean, he didn't. And so we decided to take that and run with it. And Michael, because he's really brave and uncompromising, said, I really want to play what it's like to be an adult who has suffered this kind of abuse and what kind of armor they put up to protect themselves. Well, as a result, you get a pretty prickly character. And we went for it. Now, the truth is, William Masters changed a lot in his life. And oddly, toward the end of his life was a very, very different man. So we knew starting off we were going on a journey, and we were just hoping that people would hang in there with it, which is, here is a man who has been one way his whole life and had to protect himself. And as a result of meeting Virginia Johnson and several other things happening in his life, like having children, something starts to shift. And so this is what we did. So we're in the middle of it. In fact, our season 3, something happens and Masters starts to move. He has been slowly moving through the first 2 seasons, trying to figure out who he is. He even says at the end of season 2, what's the matter with me? Like he's finally trying to understand, like, why do I behave the way I do? Why do I alienate people? Why do I push them away? Season 3, other things happened, and he starts to realize, because this is all pre-psychology. Many, many people in the 50s and the 60s had not had the benefit of any kind of therapy or analysis or anything. So a lot of times people just kind of went on in the same rut they'd always been in and never kind of looked at themselves and said, why do I do what I do? Which now, of course, everybody does. I mean, too much sometimes. So he is now undergoing this shift where he just feels compelled maybe to try and do this differently, that he can see how he's been doing things is not really working. And because things in him are starting to loosen up, he can kind of slowly try and be more of a person. And so that's what we're really exploring this year. And so he is a really fun character to watch, because he is actually undergoing a remarkable transformation, and where he ends is kind of extraordinary.
I think one of the most memorable episodes from the second season was probably Fight, which is largely a two-hander. With
Right.
Bill and Virginia in that hotel. And that was written by Amy Lippman and directed by Michael Apted. How did the idea for that episode to do it that way come about, to just sort of zero in on these two in that very kind of intimate way?
Well, one of the things, we're telling the weirdest, most unconventional love story ever. And so when you're doing that, you do have to at some point say, what is the audience rooting for here? And if you want them to root for Bill and Virginia, then you need to let people in. And I think in many ways in the first season, it started as science and they were excited, and it was a strange relationship, and it was taking place in a lab in many ways. And so that was all kind of strange and confusing and interesting, I think. And then we went through the second season, and then we got into the second season. And at the end of the first season, Masters declares himself, which was that, I want you. I mean, not you just as a partner in work. I want you. And that was a huge step for him. And so what we knew is that they would spend time in hotels. And so we thought, okay, if they're in that hotel, what are they doing? And there was some pressure at the beginning of the season to say, okay, well, answer that question right away. Like, let's see what's happening. But I felt like, well, our audience is pretty sophisticated. And I thought, why don't we hold off on that for a second? Why don't we learn in the first episode of season 2 that they are going to a hotel, and the first episode ends with them in a hotel and them sort of making this commitment to start meeting there. But we don't see it. So it was always planned from the beginning that we would have an episode where you finally get to see what is going on in that hotel room. And so it was very much by design that you would build up the anticipation of, like, wow, they keep going to this hotel, but like, what is going on in there? And so that when we did finally get there, we would finally get an hour to invest in these two, to understand what goes on between them, why they're connected, why they're so similar, what it is that makes these two tick. So that's why, but I knew it wanted to be pushed down the road a bit. So that's what we did. And it was, I think it was a remarkably successful episode, mostly because we're asking you to understand and invest in these two. And you finally knew, oh, this is what they're sort of about. And you also, because of the weird, we always thought that hotel room had its own life that was removed from real life for them. And as a result, if you get a place where you can just go that is separated from real life, you might be more willing to be honest or expose yourself or be intimate. And so that was the whole idea behind that.
In season two, you also tackled the issue of race in a big way, and that was largely through the experience of Libby Masters, Bill's wife. What made you want to explore that subject from her point of view? Was that part of the real history, or was that something that you took liberties, to
Well, we had an interest. That's an interesting example of how I never want to impose history from the outside in. That I sometimes shows do that, and it feels like, oh, okay, now we got to hit this moment in history. Now we got to hit this moment, and that seemed wrong. I mean, I just didn't want to do it that way. So we knew that Libby had a baby. We knew that her husband would not be participating as a parent, really, which is, I think, was very true. I think Bill Masters didn't really do much about parenting until later in his kids' lives. So, of course, she's going to need help. And we started talking about that. And two things sort of came together. We knew that, well, actually, a few things. We knew that Martin Luther King had come through St. Louis in 1957 and gave this incredible speech about St. Louis and where it was in terms of race relations and integration. And so that was really interesting. Also, St. Louis had an all-black hospital at the time, really the only one in the world that was training more African-American doctors and nurses than any place, anywhere. And it was run by blacks. It was, staffed by blacks. It was this remarkable hospital. And we thought that was really interesting. We ran across that in our research. And then we have Libby, who is alone and needs help taking care of a baby. And we thought, okay, well, let's take her on a really interesting journey. She has started as the character that is most kind of with her head in the sand, and will end up sort of being the character that is most aware and realistic about who she is, what situation she's in. So we thought, let's take her on this journey. So we started her with this nanny, this young African-American girl. And because she's so insecure and her life is so turned upside down, she has this baby, she's sensing her husband, of course, is involved in something else with another woman. And so she takes it, so she has a very uncharacteristic for her, because she's a very kind person, but she gets in this weird sort of power play with this young black girl, which leads to her brother coming in and sets this whole thing in motion. And it was this lovely, we just felt like, oh, what an interesting way to tell the story of a woman waking up. And because it came organically from the fact that she needed help taking care of her baby, it puts her into this world that she all of a sudden, everything starts to sort of awaken for her. So that seemed a very interesting thing. And then we knew that Masters was kicked out of his hospital, essentially. He was looking for another place to go. And we thought, ooh, and there's that African-American hospital there. So we sort of wove the two stories together. And then as a result, as Libby starts to spend more time with Robert, this guy in the core office, this brought the police in, because they would be stopped on a street, and that would seem very unconventional to, at the time, a white woman and a black man sitting in a car. So that led to then, like, well, how would that go? And all this stuff happened. And then so we wrote this storyline, and then the thing in Ferguson happened. Oh, sorry, the phone's ringing.
Okay.
So then all this stuff in Ferguson happened. And it was as if, honest to God, we were sort of airing at the same time that it happened. And it was just one of those bizarre confluences of life and art. And it was remarkable.
Beau Bridges and Allison Janney appeared briefly in season two after they had, such, a big part of season one. Do you think we'll see more of those characters, or has that story, do you think, run its course?
So, yes, so it's very exciting, because Beau Bridges was cast as a one-episode character for the pilot. We really thought, we'll cast him as the provost of the university, and that'll be it. But we loved him. And then I knew that in Masters, the real Bill Masters' life, he'd had a couple mentors, and one was a closeted gay man. And all of a sudden I was looking at Beau Bridges and I thought, oh my gosh, what if he were that guy? I mean, you would not expect it. And I thought, what an interesting story to tell. So we kept Beau around, and you know, we kept putting him in episodes, and he was like, whoa, where am I going? Where's my character going? And so we brought him into our offices one day and said, well, here's where it's going. You're a closeted gay man. And he was completely shocked. I mean, he so did not expect that that's where this was going. But he's, you know, lovely and brave and a fabulous actor. So we've kept him around. And last year we took the story, you know, a little bit further, just to say, like, well, what happened to Barton and Margaret? But both of those actors in reality had other television shows. So there was very little time to bring them in. Beau is now part of our show again. He's coming back, and he's going to be a huge part of it. And Allison Janney is also coming back for less episodes, but we are absolutely keeping that story going. As we're really keeping it going for many reasons. I mean, Margaret Scully has turned into this remarkable character, and she, of course, was just an accident as well, because once we were keeping Beau around, we thought, well, if he's a closeted gay man, he would have a wife. We thought, well, who should the wife be? And then it was like, oh, well, of course it has to be Allison Janney. And then once you have Allison Janney, then you have to really write to her, because she's so fabulous. So then her character just became this kind of remarkable story that we didn't want to give up. So what we were going to do is we're going to follow both of these people, Barton Scully in a more immediate way, because he's actually going to end up working with Masters, and Margaret Scully, because she's going on this incredible adventure of what does a woman do at that age, in that time, when her life essentially blows up and she has to reinvent herself, and what would that mean? And so we have some great stuff planned for both of them. So they're back.
Well, yeah, I want to thank you so much for talking with me today, and congratulations on the show and season 3 coming up in a few months, in July, I believe. Is that correct?
It is, yeah. Thank you, and thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for making it.
All right. So speak soon.
Yeah. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.